Hello, everyone, and welcome to the episode 52 of the Office Hours podcast. Today, we have a special guest, and in this episode, we're talking about a whole bunch of things about feature-sliced design. I have mentioned this framework a couple of times in previous episodes, and so if you're interested what that whole thing is all about, stick around and find out. Thanks. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Office Hours podcast. This is episode 52, and today we have a special guest. His name is Lev Chelyadinov, and he's a core team member for the feature-sliced design project. I've mentioned feature-sliced a few times in a couple of previous episodes, saying how I enjoy trying this methodology at work. And so Lev was kind enough to make an appearance on the podcast to talk a bit more about the project. And so, Lev, maybe you can also introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about, how you got on the project and your role there.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Lev, and I'm a front-end developer and also an open source enthusiast, which is why I'm heavily involved with the feature-sliced design project, as said. And I've been in this project for, I think, over 2 years now. I've initially discovered this project during a university course, which is kind of fun considering that usually the university education doesn't give you that much of useful knowledge, but this one was actually interesting. It caught my eye because they had a very great domain name, feature-sliced.design. I'm like, wow, that project has a cool domain name. It must be cool. So I checked it out, and then I realized that actually this might be one of the only projects that does this kind of thing. So a documented architecture for the front end. And I realized that there was a great area of contribution. And one of my personal passions is teaching. And I thought that I can really let my teaching abilities free by writing documentation for the project. So that's how I got involved more with the core team. And eventually they brought me on board. And then over a couple of restructures, I'm now leading the core team. So yeah, kind of an unexpected twist of events.
Nice.
But
Yeah.
here I am.
Yeah, very nice. Yeah, I guess when you see a domain name like that, it kind of shows you the attention to detail. And
Yeah.
as a funny story, one day I was building a project and I was registering a domain in .li, and I was like, oh, that's a cool domain. It's like from Liechtenstein. And I thought, what kind of domain can I register? And then I was like, wait, my name is Vasily. And I literally couldn't wait. I like rushed to this, like, oh my God, please tell me nobody registered before me. So now I own the very cool name Vasi.ly.
Oh, yeah.
So it's pretty nice. Yeah, so for myself, for feature-sliced specifically, I don't remember exactly how I got introduced to it, but I imagine that it was probably through Effector community, because I don't remember also where I got exposed to Effector itself, but when I went there for the first time and started looking around, I thought to myself, wow, this is really something. Because it was around the time when we were just doing like Redux and NGRX, and it was just having all sorts of weird issues. I remember trying to integrate Redux with TypeScript, and it was just a massive pain. And Effector was like fully TypeScript native, and I liked the approach, but I never really had a project to plug it into. But I always kept it in the back burner in my brain. I was hanging out around chat and like just reading what people were writing. And then one day somebody mentioned feature slice because they said like, oh, it pairs well with the whole Effector model, like multi-store splitting things around. I was like, oh, feature slice, that's kind of cool. So I went there, and it was kind of the same thing. I was like, this makes sense. Like, I haven't used it yet, but it kind of intuitively makes sense to me. And I've been looking for an opportunity to pull both of those things into a project where I can actually like leverage it and see where it can take me. And finally, about maybe 3 months ago, I kind of pushed both of these things to varying degrees into the project that I'm currently working on. But I work for English-speaking company, so And both Effector community and feature slice community are like more heavily focused on, not necessarily focused, but rather mostly Russian speaking people hang out, in chats. And so the participation and activity in English is not very high. And I think that both of those tools are really great. So my goal is to help popularize it among English speaking developers, because I think, it's worthwhile. And I also need to introduce it to my team, both projects. And you go to YouTube and you type in Effector or feature sliced, and there's not very much in English specifically. Like in Russian, there's conference talks and there's tutorials, but in English, not so much. So, I've produced a couple of tutorials for Effector in English, and I need to do more, but, it's still been summer, so I kind of been dragging my feet with that. I have to kind of sit down and get that going. And you guys were chatting in main feature slice channel about how you're currently working on like improving the documentation and like making it easier for people to onboard. And you mentioned that you want to record some sort of live stream type, live coding type. And then I reached out and said, hey, would you like to do this? And here we are.
Yeah, we absolutely share the goal of trying to popularize the methodology across the English-speaking community. I feel like there's still nothing really there for English-speaking people in terms of architecture. Some people may refer to like old posts by Dan Abramov or the framework-specific architectures, but there isn't really anything comprehensive in my opinion. So it would be really great to produce some content. And in the future, we are looking forward to recording some actual live coding. More like, I'm hoping it won't be like a live stream. I'm hoping it will be more to the point.
Yeah.
Yeah, more to the point of like actual architectural decisions. Like no one wants to see me do Tailwind CSS, for example. So,
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, no, that's perfect. So I know that you're trying to kind of expand the community in like the main chats. Like there's channels for various languages, but sadly there's not that much activity there. Every once in a while people show up. And yeah, I guess maybe for people like I kind of hinted at what feature slice design is. And usually when you talk about front end architecture, people bring up things like atomic design, which is a sort of way of like organization of components and trying to break them down by their perceived complexity, I would say. But when it comes to business logic and things related to that and just the cleanliness of it all, there's no structure. They just say, oh, hey, atoms are small and molecules are big, and that's kind of your guiding principle. But feature sliced is considerably more than that. There's like a broad organizing principle. So I know if you maybe can kind of shed some light on that, that'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is actually quite funny because why so many people point to atomic design as a front-end architecture honestly is beyond me because atomic design was never built to be a front-end architecture. It was built as a system of as a organization principle for your design system. So for like designers for things like Figma. And so somehow it caught on in the front end, even though in my opinion it really doesn't fit. Like it doesn't solve most of the front end problems. And to me, this is a huge indicator that the front end community is longing for something to fill in this gap. And yeah, it just feature-sliced design really needs to get on the radar. I hope that there's a lot more, feature-sliced design is a lot more comprehensive. And you mentioned business logic briefly. This is actually, for me, this is a term that I haven't really thought about before I started exploring feature-sliced design. So I didn't really think of logic as business logic, even though, I think the main reason why is because the word business implies like a corporate setting. And, if you're doing like a hobby project with no money or a overarching company, you don't really think of your logic like the powers the app as business logic. Yeah, but yet it's a very useful term in discussing the architecture, and that's one of the things that feature-sliced design is trying to really bring out. So it's trying to really make sure that the first thing that a new onboarded developer sees when they enter the code base is what makes your app special. Because if you were to go to something like atomic design, you can open up the atoms and you're just going to see everything.
Yeah.
And there is really no prioritization for things that are more relevant to the app and less relevant, like a UI kit. So yeah, that's why really we're trying to separate the app into certain business domains. So for example, entities, business entities, these are the things from the real world that your app interacts with. And most projects have some sort of business entity. And a really important part of application of feature-sliced design is to understand what is a business entity. And so a really good rule of thumb is to think of how your app interacts with the real world. So if you have a social network, the real world thing is, for example, a post, because a post is text or images produced by a human being, and that's what other human beings want to see. So that's kind of like the gateway to your app. And yeah, so things like that they should be prioritized in your code base to be discoverable. And yeah, that's one of the focuses.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. I was just thinking that I'm not like a big fan of object-oriented programming, but in sort of like the basics of object-oriented design, the theme is, you think about your business processes and then you kind of extract nouns and verbs, and the nouns become your classes and the verbs become the methods for those classes, and you sort of start building things out in this case from those objects. Maybe objects not a good thing, but and with Effector as well, I find that if you need to extract a piece of logic, you kind of have to spell out a bunch of things first. You create your stores, and then the logic itself is expressed as connections between those stores. And so both of those frameworks effectively force you to think more ahead of time, to plan about how you're going to break it down. And I guess with this in mind, it works out really well if you have experience and you can pinpoint what any particular thing is. Because right now in my own project, I'm in a situation where it's like, oh, this feels like a feature, and we put it in a feature, and then a whole bunch of things start like talking to it on the same level. It's like, maybe you have to, move it to an entity because it needs to be accessible. And that now I have like a whole bunch. So a bunch of things in my project right now, it feels like everything is like slowly sinking to the shared level because they all kind of need to cross import from one another. And I'm still trying to kind of make my peace with that. How, I guess the question is, in order to leverage both of these tools to the best capacity, you kind of have to retool your brain a little bit to think about your application in terms of feature sliced before you start implementing it. And like bolting it on top of an existing one is possible, but it's more difficult because it kind of resists your attempts at doing so. So maybe if you have any ideas on that.
Yeah, I think this, like the line of thinking is correct in general, but also it's a bit of a slippery slope because you risk going too much into feature-sliced design to the point where it becomes dogmatic and no longer helpful. And actually, this is one of the major mistakes that I personally have made. So when I was getting into feature-sliced design, the state of the documentation wasn't as well. Hopefully, hopefully it's become better over the time. And back then, there wasn't really much guidance on how not to go too deep into feature-sliced design. So what happened is I was struggling a lot with trying to understand what is a feature and what is an entity. And then at some point it clicked, and I was like, oh, that's what it is. And then I tried to convince everyone else to adopt this way of thinking as well. And I noticed resistance. So not like resistance as in this doesn't make sense. Resistance in the sense of like, I don't understand it. I don't understand how to determine what is an entity and what is a feature. And it turns out that the reason why this was is this kind of thinking really is, it comes with experience, and it comes with a certain amount of thinking about an app in business terms and not just in development terms. And expecting everyone to just get it or go home is a bit of a steep requirement. And so my path on this dogmatic application of feature-sliced design ended when I was writing the new tutorial for the documentation, actually. And I prepared like a basic application, and I split it all into entities and features. And my intent was to show people how to do it. And then one other core team member said, "Why do they have to be features? Why do they have to be entities? Why can't they just be in pages?" And I'm like, well, because they're features. They're entities. Like if you see an entity, you need to decompose it immediately. And this so this kind of answer didn't really satisfy the other core team member, and we had a discussion. And after that discussion, I kind of went through a bit of an existential crisis, like, oh wow, I
Everything
guess
I've been doing is wrong.
yeah, like even though it made me really it made me feel really smart. Like it made me feel, oh, I really get what are features and entities, and everyone else just doesn't seem to get it. It's kind of like their fault. But no, what actually was happening is over decomposition. And since that time, the tutorial was rewritten from the ground up, which was painful because it took a lot of effort. And the whole feature-sliced community started shifting towards the pages first approach. And as I was thinking more and more about it, this actually made more sense to me, because everyone knows how to split an app into pages. This doesn't require uh, experience in architecture. And for a lot of applications, that's actually enough. Like you don't really need to split your whole app into features and entities unless that's beneficial to your architecture. So yeah, mm, what I guess my advice would be for adopting a new project for people who are struggling is consider not separating out the features and entities up front, because usually if something isn't reused, it's just uh, the best place for it is really in the page that it resides in, because that's where people are gonna come looking for it if
Right.
they are exploring a new code base. So
Interesting.
always optimize for the experience of someone new who's going to be looking for some functionality. Usually they're going to be starting at the page component because that's just the easiest, like from the router and stuff.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess I was kind of hoping for one of those, just plug in the knowledge through the matrix directly into everyone's brain so they just kind of get it, but it looks like it's a path. And so for us right now, there's just a whole bunch of dependencies are just going wild. Everybody's importing from everywhere. So my first attempt at refactoring that was just to extract these things, because a bunch of them are being reused. Like we have a thing that governs modal dialogues because we have an external CMS, so we need to load some data from that CMS. You just give it an ID and you get a model on screen. And I was like, it's too big for a feature, so let's put it into entities. But then like that thing imports some other thing that I considered an entity that shows like error toasts, because those are also all over the application. And right now I'm looking at it, it's like, oh man, everything's going to shared. So I kind of had these several instances in refactoring where I take something that used to be not part of FSD at all. It was just sort of free floating, like SRC, whatever stuff, like some component, right? Like it normally just have a whole bunch of these folders all over the place. And I was like, okay, let's call it an entity. Let's just pull it all in one place. Let's like isolate it, expose its API. And now that I have done that, I run Steiger, which is the tool to kind of validate like ESLint for FSD specifically. And it's like, oh, you have cross imports in the same layer. I'm like, oh, damn, I do have cross imports in the same layer. Like that means like, do I have to shift it further down? So it's kind of like the growing pains of adopting it. And the other thing is like right now I'm trying not to involve the team with it as much before I get the full understanding of it, because I can't really expect them to start doing the same thing and then hitting the same problems and like having to refactor it multiple times, because I'm pretty sure it'll put people off it. And I'm hoping to have some semblance of sound architecture and then say, you see this? Going forward, replicate these patterns for these reasons, right? So then everybody can be on the same page. So I guess when it comes to refactoring existing applications, and we also have another twist on top of that, but I want to kind of save it for a little bit for later. But
Yeah,
any suggestions there?
you mentioned that you first extracted stuff into entities or features, and you've said something like, "This sounds too big for a," and this is a bit of a red flag, and also kind of a common reason why people are struggling with FSD, and unfortunately why it puts them off, because layers in FSD actually have semantic meaning. So when comparing them to layers in atomic design, actually I don't think they're called layers, but whatever. So like atoms, molecules, these things, well, yeah, sure, they also have a bit of semantics, but really atoms are small, molecules are combinations of atoms, organisms are combinations of whatever that is. And so you're inclined to determine the location of some piece of code based on how large it's perceived to be. And that's a bit of a recipe for disaster in FSD, because every layer has a certain purpose in this business first overview of a project. And so if you're trying to put something that isn't a business entity on the entities layer, that's where you're going to get conflicts of cross imports, or stuff like, oh, I need to import this in shared. How do I do that? And so stuff like that. So the layers in feature-sliced design, to remind people, there are actually 6 of them in total, but most projects don't need all 6. So you have app at the top, then you have pages. That's one of the most understandable layers. Then below are widgets, and then there's features entities, which are very business-heavy layers, and shared at the bottom. So you mentioned that your code kind of naturally syncs towards share. And that isn't really a bad thing. So if that's how you want to do it, let it happen. Let that code sync to shared, and you may just scrap the features and entities layers altogether. Like for example, a project that has shared widgets, pages, and app is a perfectly valid project from a feature-sliced design perspective. And the the point in time when the shared layer starts being unmaintainable, that's the point in time where you want to start thinking about, okay, maybe I have some business logic going on in shared. And so to use the example of your modal governor, you have like some data from the CMS, which probably has some business meaning to your project. But then you have the logic of just displaying models and managing the stacking of models and stuff like that. So that all has no business, no real business meaning to that code. So in the future, you may decide, okay, I'm going to keep most of the model code in shared, but move the CMS part a bit up, like to the entities layer or something like that.
Right. Yeah, that's
So don't
actually,
be afraid of
yeah,
just bootstrapping entities.
I think I was kind of, stuff was clicking, meshing together as you were describing it. So that's really good. The CMS is a whole other thing because there's a bunch of auto-generated code that just exposes these like GraphQL methods to pull data in. So it'll be, I keep it isolated for now because this is going to be quite a big refactoring. The other interesting twist that I have, well, first of all, our application is built on Next, and I'm in chat for FSD, and a lot of people are like, hey, I have a Next application. What do I do with my pages? So for now, I'm not really concerned about it that much because, again, the project is mostly about loading the CMS data and rendering it. So there aren't as many fixed pages. A lot of it just comes through like dynamic rendering. But the pages that we do have, those are the ones where all the business logic happens, and the rest is just like informational. So the split with pages is not the worst thing for us. However, there's a really interesting quirk of Next.js that is really painful and unintuitive, which is if you accidentally leak your server-side code into your client-side code, you're going to have a bad time. Like, for instance, you have something that, let's say, something that imports a file that imports another file, and that file imports a library that imports, let's say, like child process or some node internal server-side code. It leaks all the way through that chain of imports, and then you open up the page and Webpack is like, well, I don't know what child process is, go away. And you have to kind of trace where that import came from. And so when we started basically saying, oh, I have this entity or this shared item, and there's like dash server and dash client, and never the twain shall meet, otherwise bad things are going to happen. And you cannot really detect it automatically. It always fails at runtime. And so we got tripped up by it so many times. And feature-sliced is like, is it okay? Because again, and I'm thinking in practical terms, like you're supposed to have a public API exposed through the index file. And if you just have like a barrel export where index file exports from both server and client, inadvertently the server code starts leaking into the client, and that whole thing happens. So you have to split it entirely, even though they do govern kind of the same thing. So there's a bit of a, you can do it as a workaround, but conceptually it feels like there's a bit of a conflict because it is the same thing we're talking about. It's just like different sides of it, one from the point of view of server and the other from the point of view of client.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And actually, it's kind of funny. I remember reading an article. I don't remember who wrote the article, but the article was criticizing frameworks like Quick. Quick is a pretty obscure framework in my experience, but frameworks like Quick and Remix, and I really like Remix, so that article was interesting to me. Like, why can someone not enjoy Remix? And what they were talking about is how frameworks like that change the semantics of your regular JavaScript. So suddenly part of your code is meant to run on the server and be tree shaken away. And if you write code in a .server.ts file, it means something else than if you write it in a .client.ts file, for example.
Right.
And yeah, which is actually pretty valid criticism. So this really is kind of a framework design issue, but regardless, it's what we're settled with. So we gotta somehow fix it. And there are several approaches how this can be fit into feature-sliced design. I personally have experience with Remix, and in my experience, exporting server code from the same index file as client code, like components, didn't pose problems because the tree shaker was smart enough to tree shake away the code that was only meant to run on the server. But if it happens that you have, well, like if, for example, your tree shaker doesn't cannot determine that this part of the code is only meant to be running on the server, then there is no shame in having several indexes, one for your server code and one for your client code. Because what feature-sliced design really prescribes is to have a public API. It doesn't necessarily prescribe to have an index.ts file, and this is a part of the guidelines that I'm personally working on right now. I'm trying to figure out how to best advise people on situations like this, and also on a very similar situation where you have an index.ts file in your shared UI, and suddenly you import code, like you import one component, and then everything goes into your bundle, which isn't great. So, yeah, there are several ways to do this, but one of the simplest ways would be to just have several index files if that's what your needs are.
I see.
And you briefly mentioned Steiger. That is our linter that, apart from other things, also checks that you have a public API. And unfortunately, at the moment, it's expecting an index.ts file. So this is also a part of the guidelines that should be encoded in a linter. And to do that, we need to first figure out how the hell can we actually what is a public API?
Right.
Because another way to define a public API is like a monorepo with a package.json. That's also a perfectly valid way of defining a public API.
I guess you could say that too.
So
Yeah.
this is an active field of research for us. But to move forward, definitely feel free to make several public APIs, and that's fine.
Yeah, that makes sense. So because right now, I realized that after I started doing the splits, and again, maybe I should just do what naturally comes out in terms of organization, but I ended up having to bypass the API a whole bunch, because otherwise I would start getting cyclic dependencies, which it was also not very happy about. And again, it's like one of these things that's like, oh, it crashes at runtime. Okay, let's trace. So I even ended up using tools like Madge, which builds you like a graph of dependencies to trace if I have cyclic dependencies or not, and like try to sever them by not importing through the barrel export. So this is still a part where I don't have like 100% confidence in what I'm doing is right, and I kind of need to understand, is it because the framework is forcing me to do these things and it's just an unfortunate thing that I have to deal with, or I'm doing something wrong and I need to understand where that mistake lies. So right now I'm just kind of slicing at it piece by piece, trying to make sense of it, which is not helped by the fact that in the meantime everybody's just committing code the old ways and ignoring most of the stuff that I'm doing completely. But yeah, it kind of feels like the tree shaker isn't really doing its job. I don't know what happens in Remix, but in Next, it is smart enough to shake away if you're using some method inside like use effect. It knows it's like client side only, so it tries to do some optimizations, but in general, right now it's kind of a disaster. So, man, front end is so complicated. I've been doing it for like 15, 18 something years, and I don't know. Every once in a while, I start pining for the good old days of, Apache and PHP, where just we had none of these problems whatsoever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I don't know if you've read a recent article by Dominic Dorfmeister, also known as TK Dodo, quite a famous person in the React community, also like a contributor to React Query. And he wrote an article that's called "Please Stop Using Barrel Files."
Barrel files, yeah. I think I might have actually read that one. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a good article, although I don't fully agree with the points in it. Like, I think that it's a bit of a demonization of barrel files, and the problems that are assigned to barrel files also exist outside of them. So just by eliminating barrel files, you're not automatically ridding yourself of these problems.
Right.
But one thing I wanted to mention about it is, from what I hear, you in your project, you're struggling with imports from the public API because of cyclic dependencies. And I personally recommend maintaining an import structure such that whenever you're importing code within one slice, So for example, if you're working within a page, then the code inside that page should be imported with relative imports and not from the index file. So you import directly from the file by stepping like a couple of directories back. But if you're importing from another slice, or maybe from shared, that's where you want to use absolute imports and import only from the public API. And that's how you can ensure that, it's not going to rid you of cyclic dependencies completely, but it is at least going to make sure that you're not like introducing them in ways that you don't have to. So if you have an option to import something if we're talking intra-slice dependencies, you can either import it directly or through the public API, and that's definitely going to introduce a cycle, which is something that can be avoided with.
Yeah, I think we kind of follow this where there's like a model and then there's UI, but then UI needs to import some other components, and through that chain, the UI starts pulling. And because UI, probably it is happening because we have cross-slice imports, so those need to be fixed first.
Could be, yeah.
Yeah, because like I have, for the things that I already mentioned, like the model dialog and a toast. And toasts are wired up to appear whenever like some error conditions happen, just to kind of notify some people that something went wrong. And the modal, because we're loading it dynamically from CMS, that call could fail. So if it fails, we display a toast. But then, so you need to import the UI of a toast, or at least not the, so you're importing the model of a toast because there's an effector event that triggers the toast. Mm-hmm. So you pull that in, and because that gets pulled in through the index, it also imports the component, and then the component in turn imports something else, and like they all can converge at some point eventually. So this is likely a problem with cross-slice importing and should be fixed, and maybe it'll go away and I will not have that problem anymore.
Okay, could be.
Yeah. But I guess this is I always like to advocate for these things, but I also need to understand like all of the different tripwires that you can trip over to, because if you recommend something and then people have bad time with it, they're gonna hate you for it, right? So
right.
Yeah, that's why in the beginning, maybe because I think I learned about it, I don't know, a couple of years ago, but I haven't been actively using it. And I just remember going through documentation and saying like, you know what, I don't really understand what's going on. I had to go to like GitHub code of projects to sort of take a look at what is this beast to make sense of it. So you're saying you're currently working very studiously on improving the documentation and writing tutorials. So I imagine the core team is perfectly aware of the fact that right now it's kind of hard to get into it. Like it needs some sort of onboarding. Maybe as a quick aside, when I was starting Redux all those years back, I did Dan Abramov's tutorial of how to build your own Redux, which takes a couple hours, and you build like a toy version of Redux, and then you have perfect clarity about what Redux is, and you have like no problem. And unironically, like it's like you get it, and that's it. You can build stuff in Redux, no problem. So it kind of almost feels like it needs to be something like this. It's like you need to build something to kind of get a feel for it and to have a better time going forward.
Yeah, well, this was also my experience, funnily enough, when I was trying to make sense of feature-sliced design for the first time. I was reading the docs and I kept thinking to myself, I don't understand this. And then there are just more pages, and some of them are like contradictory to each other. And a very insidious side effect of this actually is something that I've learned from one of the design books. I think it may have been Don't Make Me Think, which is where when a user struggles with an interface, like with the design of something, they usually tend to blame themselves. So like, for example, if there's an electric kettle and I don't know how to turn it on, I'm going to be blaming myself for being such an awkward village person and not knowing how to turn on a kettle. And I won't think that, wow, this kettle is really poorly designed.
Right.
And So this is also one of the reasons why I am so like I put so much importance on restructuring the docs, because a lot of people are struggling, and even I was struggling, and um, yeah, they come away thinking that they're stupid, and that's the opposite of what we want. We want to make people feel smart, and so yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But the core team is very aware that the documentation is a weak point, and yeah, it has been improving, and we're not done. So
Yeah. No,
hopefully, it's only going to get better with time.
that's great to hear. I have a kettle that allows you to like pick the temperature, and there's a certain sequence of button presses where you need to turn it on, and then you pick the temperature, and then you press the on switch to actually start the boiling process. And once you know it, it's like, okay, tits, you know, you're done. But
Yeah.
our relatives come in and it's like, oh, can you put the kettle on? So yeah, absolutely. There's
Yeah.
also other a great book called, I think it's Design of Everyday Things.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. It
Yeah,
may have been that book because I
yeah.
read them both and I don't remember which one of them, but they're both great.
Yeah. So definitely. It's. I remember looking at it. It's like, man, I've been doing front end. I feel like it's the correct thing to do, but I just can't understand where to put things. I think right now my page is the page where it shows you like the examples of slices and different segments and what theoretically could go into those things
Hmm.
to kind of make more sense of it. So yeah, hopefully more documentation. And live,
It's actually a terrible page.
it's a terrible page. Oh damn, I've been using a wrong page. That's the one that makes most sense to me right now.
Yeah, yeah. That's a problem. So like I already rewrote this page, but it's still not merged, and I'm just so eager to do that because I have a feeling that it's gonna be a tipping point. So because a lot of people are pointing to that page with questions, so it clearly isn't doing its job.
Right. Well, I mean, I'm happy to provide even sometimes like the negative feedback is necessary to
Yeah,
understand
yeah, absolutely.
where the pain points are. So yeah, I'm kind of hoping for a lot of great things for feature sliced, and um, I guess I really enjoyed watching. It was probably your video when you were going through Steiger and like building custom linters sort of on a fly as part of that
Hmm.
presentation.
Yeah.
So something of that nature, but just with the framework itself, not necessarily the tool, but the framework itself, I find at least for some people could be very helpful. Like I'm no stranger to watching 2 hour long podcasts on topics that interest me. I know it's not for everybody. A lot of people seem to want like a 45-second TikTok video to explain these things. So maybe there's a need for both, but it would certainly be welcome. And if I can help in producing it in any capacity, count me in, because I think that'll be a lot of fun.
Yeah, I think that's definitely going to be helpful.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we'll get to do more and maybe dive a little bit more deep. And also, as I gain more understanding of it, I will have better questions next time, I guess, is what I'm
And I think it
trying
will
to
also
say.
be really useful to actually like talk specifics. So I mean, of course, it doesn't have to be your particular project if it's bound by NDA.
Yeah.
But if we have like a model
Mm-hmm.
that we can decompose just in plain words, I think that's gonna be like yeah, quite a good introduction to how you may start thinking in FSD.
Yeah. I'm sort of hoping to record some tutorials on Effector side of things, and I was I'm thinking of building like a weather app, sort of like on your phone,
Hmm.
where you have like multiple cities
Hmm.
and you have weather and you have like forecast for the future and like settings pages. So maybe there's a potential for like having a session with like design of the structure and entities and breakdown, and then on top of that there's going to be, oh, you can use Effector to do this and that. So
Yeah.
that could be an interesting project, and I think we can spend some time in the future to discuss the details. Cool. Well, I learned a lot. I think that I can feel the cogs turning, and it sucks that it's Saturday and I don't get to just go in and immediately start start poking at things to figure things out. So I don't know if you want to maybe say anything as a follow up, or what we should hope to look forward to from the core team and the project in general.
Yeah, so the core team it could really use some extra help with developing, like with fixing all of these issues, rewriting the docs, and also expanding the capabilities of Steiger. So if you are interested in contributing, then you're very welcome in both our GitHub, like issues, pull requests, discussions, anything like that, or also in the Telegram chat if you're into that thing. And yeah, we'll always reply. And the future, I hope, is really bright for FSD. The linter is only going to get better and only more capable. So now there are still like some manual tweaks for people to go through, and we're hoping to make it like a zero config interactive experience. And yeah, and I'm also dreaming of some media influencer on the English-speaking community to feature FSD. Like, I don't know, would be so cool to appear in a video by like Theo or someone.
Yeah, I keep spamming their comments and be like, check out Effector, check out FSD, but you know they have so many comments that it's you probably need to become like a Patreon, or do like a live stream donation of a couple of $100 to get like read out in a TTS, and then maybe they can, you know, take a look at it. But yeah, something like
Right.
that would be huge. I mean, my channel is nowhere near that size, but one of the excuse me, one of the goals of recording this was to just have some content in English that people can point to and say, well, you know, you can check this out. So maybe it'll grow.
Well, yeah, we really appreciate the efforts in making FSD more recognized in the English-speaking community, because I think that's very important. This is something that the front-end community needs, regardless of their country or language.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so very much for your time, Lev. It's been great. I can't wait till Monday so I can start trying to implement all of these things. And, you know, we'll keep in touch and do more of a more pointed or a deep dive sometime in the future. So stay tuned, folks. And I hope you enjoyed this. And we'll see you the next one. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Bye.
Bye bye.